Well, this is unusual. In almost 9 years and over 770 episodes, you and I have never found ourselves in the position that we're in today, and this G35 series should give you a damn good indication of what that is. You see, our journey in this thing of ours is to drive not only different cars, but different variations of each of those cars. Great example, 991.2 Carreras, all the way up to GT3s, with a stop along the way of 4S Targas and turbos. Well, this started out with that. We started with like middle of the road, 335 horsepower, 540. Then we went to the bottom of the barrel, like 250 or so horsepower in the 530, even a plug-in version. But then we completely skipped over this and went right to the full fat 600 horsepower M5 on a track, no less. And this is the sweet spot, people, and here's why. This is the M550 Xdrive. That means, yes, all-wheel drive. We'll get to that later, but let's focus on really what we need to just understand why this thing is important. 4.4-liter twin-turbo V8. Yes, that sounds awfully familiar to that M5 we drove, but here, 456 horsepower comes in at 5,500 RPM, stays flat all the way to 6,000 RPM. Not a huge window there. But then there's the torque, and I know I'm guilty of being a freak about the torque, but this is something special. This is not like the bare-chested, like, you know, in Detroit where they have the fist right there. That's not this model, but it has 480 pounds of torque. Let me repeat that, 480 pounds of torque, when it comes in at 1,800 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 4,750 RPM. And this ain't the best one out there. This is kind of like the sleeper. It's like Bill Gates famously said, don't let them see you coming. So now, our job today, although we're very late to it, is to drive the don't let them see you coming version of the G35 series. Alrighty then, a little bit later than expected, but still it's crack open 456 horsepower and a very familiar car to us. Comfort mode on all of the throttle mapping and steering and all that kind of crap. Put our foot into it. Let's just say comfort. It's comfort for the Luftwaffe, not comfort for like a Lexus. Remember that 530? We drove that thing and that in comfort mode felt like an ES300. Not slow, just kind of pillowy in the way it delivered power. But you guys know the drill by now. We ain't here for comfort. We're here for sport. Put our foot into it, going around a nice turn, elevation change, really dig ourselves out of this thing. It sounds better. It definitely sounds better, but it's still about the same. Well, it doesn't feel explosive. Remember that 600 horsepower M5 didn't feel explosive either. I think the best way to put it is it's much sharper in power delivery in sport mode than in comfort mode. Not so much more power, it just delivers power a little bit more precise. Something tells me BMW has changed around their priorities, because in previous versions of this car, this was explosive. Like, do you remember the first time you drove an E39 5 Series? My God, that was otherworldly back then. And this is still otherworldly when you compare it to its contemporaries, but it's linear as opposed to explosive. That's the difference from the previous version to this in the M550. Got it? So before we go on any further, I need to set up the next segment for you with a couple of important points. First, the wheels. Very attractive, although I'm still partial to the design they had on E39 540s. That was kind of like the high watermark. But these 19 inches, this is what's standard. There are 20s that are on offer. More importantly, what are those wheels connected to? And that is the Xdrive System. Unless you've been living on a rock for the past 20 years, that is BMW speak for all-wheel drive. And I get the whole argument for all-wheel drive in a car like this and bad weather and you do all this traction, blah, blah. But you and I, how many times have I told you that we're broken? We don't care about traction in bad weather. We care about driving dynamics, man. We care about Freude am Fahren. That's what these people have been selling us since the early 70s. So damn it, give it to us. Well, apparently they're starting to do that again. So, you know, we drive like Korean cars, like that Stinger. It sends up to like 80% of the torque to the rear wheels. It's a very specific finite number. Here, they used to do that, not so much anymore, because they went and got this like fancy computer that they put in this thing, and the fancy computer constantly monitors like input from the driver, what's going on, the ambient temperature, all sorts of things, and it can change what amount of torque is going to which wheel. But in this case, it's really focused on sending the majority of that torque, remember 480 pounds of it, to the rear wheels. So now that you know that, we're going to try that by throwing this in a couple of corners. But here's the thing. You need to know one number before we do that. 4,537 pounds. Let me repeat that. 4,537 pounds. Okay, even though I'm not very excited to do this, let's roll back into the old celery mode here, come around this turn, and let's unpack a little driving dynamics. So, yeah, anything you want is all-wheel drive, as we discussed in the tech review and just previously. How does that really work out here? Well, this is kind of like that M5 in that it's rear-wheel drive bias. The problem is you can't completely turn it off. So let's understand here in this nice elevation change. Brake, 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 brake. Put our foot into it to get the hell out of this turn here. And you definitely feel something a bit different than an all-wheel drive car. And for me, it's an unusual sense. Like when I get into an Audi and I drive very aggressively on these exact same roads, I get nauseous. That's like my spidey sense when all-wheel drive is kicking in too much. Here, my stomach is like super strong right now. And this is after, I want to say, a solid hour of fooling around out here. Because I want to be prepared for you guys. I want to do my homework. And you barely feel like you're fighting the front wheels, like it's trying to do two planes of motion. And that's really the big takeaway of the driving dynamics of the Xdrive system on the more powerful M550, in that you do feel like it's a two-wheel drive car. Granted, I would love that switch like they have in the M5. But in fairness to all Germans, it's not just BMW that's doing this. Like, we spent some time, you and I, in a lot of all-wheel drive Mercedes as of late, and they too kind of have the same thing where they're really going out of their way to make it drive like a rear-wheel drive car in the sporting mode, but still have, and there's no way to sugarcoat this, the reason why they're giving you the all-wheel drive is to be able to sell it in more areas, because in Sunbelt areas, two-wheel drive is great, but most of these things are sold in Chicago, New York, England, places where it doesn't look like this in February. Okay, now that we've got the child's play out of the way, let's really handicap the crap out of this thing. Sport mode going downhill. Remember, this is 4,500 plus pounds. Put our foot into it. Please don't try this at home. Much more dynamic driving, obviously. Not quite as flat as that M5 was in the track, but you really don't expect it to be. And oh, by the way, there's that whole safety thing, because not everybody is you and I, like a broken car guy and car gal that have been to track days that could probably wheel these things around tracks. Most of the people that buy these things, frankly, they don't know how to drive them. So instead of having the car go over there into a ditch, it can go around corners, even if the driver isn't as skilled. Now you understand why most of these things are sold as an all-wheel drive. So I think you would agree that we have driven a ton of G35 series over the past year. None was more fancy than that one we drove in Great Falls, Virginia. Same color and everything, but that was a 530. And what was unique about that, or really frustrating, was the base price. It had, the total of options was almost equal to the base price, and that was a 4-cylinder. This one is not as like completely kitted out to within an inch of its life, but someone went through the option list in a rather astute way. Like, for example, it has not one but 3 driver's assistance / handling packages that total $7,600 as a basic comparison. My friend Marcos, the episode I did, like a year and a half ago, he bought a whole used electric car for $7,000. Then a cold weather package, $500. Executive package, $1,300. Parking assistance package, $700. Then let's put this under the heading of throwing me a bone here, man. There is the gesture control. We saw that on the 7 Series. An extra $190. And then this really, think of this as like an open letter to the folks at BMW, and I'm being dead serious here. Apple CarPlay, $300? Are you serious? Kias have it as standard. And then I read recently, BMW now changing it, that after 3 years, they charge you a subscription service to Apple CarPlay. Guys, you gotta change that. I understand you're trying to send people to use your UX, but you just can't do that. You gotta change it. And then let's go back to cool options. I'll get off my soapbox. Night vision, $2,300, definitely very cool. But my favorite by far, and you know what's coming, the Bowers and Wilkins stereo at $3,400. And it's not just the speaker grills in this case. There's actually lighted tweeters in this. So it's audio as well as a visual feast. And now for something completely different, especially with a 450 plus horsepower car. Let's find a little light traffic. Now there's a method to my madness here, so follow me for a minute. We have discussed these like multiple adjustable modes in these fancy cars. Dampers, steering, transmission, but most importantly, the throttle mapping with an eye towards the fuel economy. Well here, there's not just one, there's actually two fuel economy modes. There's the Comfort, which we're in now, then there's an Eco Pro. So as much as we love this sport display, which I gotta say, I use this more than the Apple CarPlay because I like to know what the horsepower, especially the torque as we're driving. But here we go, Eco Pro, and it goes into an individual setup. So you know, like in all the other cars that you've seen in recent episodes, like that AMG, both the S63 and the GTC, where it can go in, it can set everything into full fat except for the engine, and just put it on the first Eco mode, because there's only one Eco mode in those kind of cars. Here, there's two. But it's not just an Eco mode like, do you want it more fuel efficient? There's a menu of sorts. So let's go into that. We go into Vehicle Settings, go into Driver Experience Control, and yeah, you configure the Sport mode, which I did. But let's go into Individual Eco. Now here, there's the usual stuff, the stuff we're excited about, which we can set the damper, the steering to the sports setting. So this is how I've been driving the car around town. But more importantly, there are 4 different menu items here. Coasting, Eco Pro Seat Control, Eco Pro Climate Control, and Eco Pro Sight. Now 2 of those are self-explanatory. Let's start with that Eco Pro Sight. That's interesting. I had to dig into the menu to find out about that. It lowers the heating element on the mirrors and the exterior glass. Neat touch. It adds about 10% more fuel economy. But the big thing is the coasting. You can switch on and off the coasting. Now, the first time we saw that was in, the 981 Boxster with a PDK, where the thing will coast when you have your foot off the accelerator and not in neutral. So like right now, I can take my foot off the accelerator. Please don't try this at home. You can see I'm not on the accelerator at all, but the car is now in coast mode where it's only turning about 600 RPM as we go down this hill. But let's now put our foot back into it. Engine now switches back on. So the whole concept is to add, do you want 70% fuel economy, 80%, 90%? That's what this whole Eco Pro mode thing does. And I gotta say, it's interesting in a car with 450 horsepower, because I'm turning, on average, it's telling me 20.2 mpg with 480 pounds of torque, and I haven't exactly been driving it gingerly, shall we say. It's been more like this. Even an Eco Pro mode. So you could call this tech for technology's sake, but for a cheapskate like me, I kind of like that you can go in and check off different items in the menu. Speaking of tech, the one thing I do have off here, which I will switch back on, is you can go into the wireless Apple CarPlay. Hopefully, the hocus pocus of the BMW connected group that sits high atop the Boeing headquarters building in Chicago somehow has worked here. So now let's go over to, Apple CarPlay, hit that, and boom, we have Apple CarPlay. I even have 3 text messages. So I'm going to send you guys back to the hangar, and I'm going to find out who is so intrigued to chat with me. For the life of me, I can't remember if I told you this behind-the-scenes story, but do you remember when we drove that G30 540 over a year ago? Back when I was there going over the car, one of my BMW contacts, he was like, wait until you drive the M550. He went on and on and on about it, worse than Coleman ever has, about how it bests the F10 M5 in so many ways. Lighter, 0 to 60 is better, all that kind of stuff. So you can imagine that these ridiculously high expectations, and I had to wait a year to drive it, which made it only worse. So this is really unfair to this car. But I rolled into it, and yeah, you found that we have this different power delivery, kind of like we found in that M5. It's not explosive, it's linear. And I guess that's just the way it's going when you have a twin-turbo V8. But what I didn't expect, and this my contact didn't even prep me on, remember that eco mode, that eco when I changed into my like home brew of full fat in the suspension and everything else? Honestly, that was what spoke to me in this thing, that one can have displacement in an era of V6 twin turbos and 4-cylinder turbos with electrification. So allow me for a moment to interject over myself. Before I picked this thing up, I was visiting Paccioni. You remember him. He was my Targa Newfoundland teammate. Well, he's got the previous generation of this thing, the 550, the V8, the whole thing. And he commutes something like 40 miles each way every day on that stupid expensive 407 tollway they have in Toronto. Anyway, his fuel economy, 12. No joke, saw it myself, 12. Now, back to what I was saying. We get our old-fashioned V8 back, but still 20 mpg in a 4,500 pound car. This like blows my mind. I know it's as exciting as keeping your shoes on at the airport 20 years ago, but people, it's kind of like we're going back before the TSA. That's what this whole thing is. It's like from a time gone by, but you still get sort of fuel economy. Granted, the Prius folks are gonna laugh at us, but you know, hell, we laugh at them. I mean, this is what you want, not a Prius. So I have lowered my expectations of F10 M5s to this is a totally newer interpretation of something we expected in Freude am Faden 20 years ago. Now with that, all of this comes at a very high price. This is about a $74,000 car, US, base price. This one is incredibly expensive at $86,000 with a couple of options, not even cooled seats. So I'm gonna turn this around to you guys and leave you with a very obvious question. For $86,000, not 74, because most people or most dealers you're going to go to are gonna have one like this in the stunning Mediterranean blue, which I think every one of them except for the 530e we drove in Chicago has been this color, and I can see why BMW finished it in this color. Anyway, for $86,000, what would you choose? Would you go with an M550, or would you save a couple of bucks, go like down to a 540 or a 530, or is there something else that you would go for at 86,000 US or whatever the equivalent? And let me know why you would choose it. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all word, MotoManTV all word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I'm going to say once again, download our fancy updated new app on Amazon. Until I see you next time, bis später.